My name is Tom Baldwin. I'm the Dean of the College of Natural and Agricultural Sciences. Before I do any introductions, I've been asked several times tonight what AVID stands for. There have been signs out here about AVID. It stands for Advancement via Individual Determination. It's a program of our schools. This series in global climate change, I think that those of you who have been able to come to the previous lectures are probably by now convinced that indeed it is a complex subject, one that we have a great need for more data, more understanding of the processes at play. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are several groups I would like to acknowledge. First, I would like to acknowledge the Science Circle members whose donations to the college make this lecture series possible. With the Science Circle members, I know y'all are hiding in the back, some of you now, but would you please either stand up and wave your hands and so on? Some are here in the front, okay? Thank you all very much. This group not only supports this lecture series, but their donations also go to a series of awards and excellence for top students in the college. We have just gone through the process of selecting 10 students who will receive awards in a couple of weeks. I'm not going to announce the names because I've only just received the email with them and have not committed it yet to memory. But we'll know soon, as will they. I also want to thank the graduate students in the Department of Earth Science who help us out in this lecture series as ushers. Tonight's are Michael Trumbauer and Daryl Kahut. Thank you both very much. One of the groups for whom this lecture series is really intended are the teachers in the local schools. These are our partners. These are the people who get students ready to come to the university. They work with us in a very professional and admirable way. They do a great job with preparing students. Are there teachers here tonight? And if you are, would you please stand up? I think that you all deserve a round of applause. And Dale, you could stand up too. We count you in that group. I have kept my eyes open tonight looking for members of the school board, but are there members of the school board? It's been rumored that Luke Vanderstill came in, but I haven't seen him. No school board members. Well, we'll note that. Now, finally, a little bit of housekeeping. The first two lectures in this series were over in the Highlander Union Building, the Hub, room 302. This lecture is obviously here. I'm glad you made it. The next two lectures are back in the Hub. So remember, the lecture that is 2 weeks from tonight and 4 weeks from tonight will be in Highlander Union Building 302. Now, tonight's lecturer is Professor Mike Allen. He has a number of jobs here at UCR. He is department head in the Department of Plant Pathology and Microbiology. And let me say that the most difficult job in the university is that of a department chair, because that's right where everything grinds. And Mike has done an admirable job in that position. He's also the director of the Center for Conservation Biology. A group of faculty that he directs in that center do an absolutely marvelous job in studying the environment in inland Southern California. They work with municipalities across Southern California in terms of multi-species habitat protection plans and so on. Mike started off in Winfield, Kansas, where he attended Southwestern College, received his Bachelor of Science in Biology. I'm told that during his undergraduate years, he was the concert master. That's the principal violinist of the college orchestra. He was the president of the student council, and lettered in tennis. It's been a long time, right, Mike? He chose University of Wyoming for graduate school, received his master's degree in 1977, PhD in 1980, both in botany. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Nebraska, and in 1981, he joined the faculty at Utah State University in Logan as a research assistant professor. In 1988, he moved as an associate professor to San Diego State University, where he remained for 10 years. That stay there was punctuated by a 2-year trip to Washington, D.C., where he served as a program officer in the Division of Environmental Biology at the National Science Foundation. In 1998, University of California, Riverside decided to establish a Center for Conservation Biology and advertised widely for a director of that program. Mike applied, and fortunately, he accepted the offer that was presented to him as director. He's been the director ever since. He made some sort of a serious mistake in '04 and became also the chair of the department. His research specialty is in ecology of microbial plant-soil interactions, that incredibly complex mix of what happens at the interface between soil, the roots of a plant, and the microorganisms that inhabit that environment together. Very complicated, complex biological zone that's vitally important to life on Earth. More recently, Mike has concentrated on global change dynamics and conservation restoration of natural ecosystems. He's author or co-author of more than 180 journal articles and 3 books. He's considered the international authority in his area of specialty, and his research has been called 5 to 10 years ahead of its time. Please join me in welcoming Mike to the stage.
Okay, let's see if that works. Can you hear me? I still do remember the years when I would stand up in front of a class with just chalk and chalkboard and write my notes and yell a little bit louder over the snoring of the students. So, see if I can get all this electronic stuff to work here. What I'd like to do is to talk about the impacts of climate change on the biology, ecology, and the state of California. Now, just in case you didn't figure this one out, this is Bonita at one of our tropical field stations. You might see an eyeball there, and you might see a few teeth down here. And Bonita was always one of those who was the local crocodile who was sitting around waiting for somebody who was not paying attention to the environment around them. And I'm afraid that's one of the concerns that we have as scientists here, those of us who study biotic processes, organisms, and the Earth. I focus my work as an ecologist, and particularly a soil ecosystem ecologist, on the interaction between organisms and the environment. And it's interesting because the environment that I'm interested in playing with is one that's about 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. And in that little 1 centimeter cubed, there are about 100,000 individual organisms. There are about 10,000 species. There's about a mile of fungal hyphae, and they form complex food webs, including plant roots, algae, fungi that are both symbiotic and decomposers, bacteria, and then all of the critters that wander around there, including this pseudoscorpion who's the top dog in this area. Just as important, it is at this scale that carbon is fixed by the plant, transferred to the soil, and then either released back into the atmosphere or fixed into the soil, what we call the process of sequestration, which removes the carbon from the atmosphere. And it is at this scale that all of the real processes of carbon cycling occur that affect the globe and that in turn the global climate effects. So in fact, what we've been trying to do is to take that tiny little 1 centimeter cubed and scale it back up to the size of the globe, and then in turn take the information that global climate scientists are giving us and scale that back to how it influences that 1 centimeter cubed. And by going back and forth, we can begin to understand what are the implications of climate change to our system, and how is our system going to feed back into climate change. Now, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about evidence for climate change. Then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the biological implications, and then finally get into how they are influencing us and how we might in turn influence them. I don't want to spend too much time on the evidence for climate change. Martin Kennedy in the first lecture gave an outstanding overview of the mechanisms for climate change, but I think it's important to review those, particularly in the context of our understanding how we might deal with those and how they might affect us. There are really 4 major components that scientists use to understand that climate change is in fact occurring. The first is the physical forcing functions, and I'll talk just about each of these in more detail, but that is simply those factors that are forcing climate change and the physics behind those factors. Second, and I'll spend a little bit of time, is on outputs from climate models, which have become the straw man for everyone to beat on. Third is paleoclimate patterns, what we know about the climate, and particularly climate and CO2 in the past. Fourth, ongoing climate measurements. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the biotic responses and how they relate, but also how the climate change relates to them. In particular, I'm interested in California. It's not only because I live here, although that makes it probably the most important state in the Union, but also because California is uniquely positioned as a laboratory for studying both how climate change occurs and how it influences the processes of interest to people. California is uniquely positioned because we tend to have low water vapor, which means high reflectivity, which means CO2 has a potentially greater impact. It's a complex topography, and we have, much of our, as Rich Minnick pointed out last lecture, much of our climate is driven by ocean currents. And then finally, the biology is very complex, consisting of complex ecological feedbacks and a lot of carbon fixation and sequestration. Just to kind of orient you, I'll have a lot of slides with pictures of the Salton Sea, and if you see the Salton Sea, that'll help orient you in the various, and of course, UCR, the site of all important academic activities. I'm also going to be talking a lot about the James Reserve, and the reason for that is the James Reserve is where we're doing some of these very, very detailed high-resolution studies in which we look at the exchanges that are going on between the atmosphere, the plants, and the soil. And just to orient you, the James Reserve is up near Idlewild, so it also makes a very good place to do one's research in the middle of the summer. Okay, forcing functions. I don't want to spend too much time, but a forcing function is simply those forces that push the climate, or in particular the temperature, up or down. Greenhouse gases have been known to be a forcing function for over 100 years. And so that is why one of the things we're concerned about is CO2 in the environment. And we also look, because back in the late 1800s, CO2 was pointed out that it was going to increase, and as it increased, the global climate change was going to increase. But the idea of Arrhenius was that it would take several millennia. And then in work, and particularly in the late 1950s, it started up on the Mauna Loa, began looking at the change in CO2 in our atmosphere. And you can see here's the 1960s. In fact, when you go to any ecological or climatological meeting, all you have to do is go like this, and everybody knows exactly what you're referring to. You're referring to the CO2 change. A couple of things to point out is in 1960, we were running around 310 to 312 parts per million of CO2. When I was in graduate school just a couple of years ago, in the 1970s, we memorized the global atmospheric CO2 at 330 parts per million. Now that's important because we're now approaching 390 parts per million. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later about a tipping point that people have referred to. And one of the concerns that James Hansen has pointed out is what he talks about as a tipping point at being 450 parts per million. Now, it's important to remember because since I was a graduate student to today, and from today's CO2 value to that 450 tipping point is about the same time. So I suppose I'm halfway through my career. I want to point out one of the difficulties in trying to understand energy balance and environmental change. We're looking at most of the research and most of the things you hear about in the newspaper is the averages. And if we look at the average global solar radiation, that's the total amount of energy coming in, is around 340 watts per meter squared. Now, what people are talking about is if we move to 450 parts per million CO2, that will increase the retention of the long-wave radiation, that is, the heat that should have escaped. That will add about 3 watts per meter squared. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But also note that a drop of 6.5, which is in reflection, and the 180 ppm CO2 that existed during the Ice Age, a drop of only 6.5 watts per meter squared would put us back into that Ice Age. So small changes in these total radiation balances make a huge difference for our climate. The other thing that I wanted to point out is how difficult it is to actually get at that figure and scale it down to what we're interested in our local environment. Because at the top of the atmosphere, there's approximately a little over almost 1,400 watts per meter squared coming in at the peak of the day, hitting the top of the atmosphere. And we can see that distributed down through the canopy. And if you look in there, you can see that it peaks at about 1,000 watts per meter squared. This is actual data from the James Reserve for one day, and you can see how much variation, both in shortwave radiation, that radiation coming in from the sun, and long-wave radiation, that heat going out, and how much that's varying just over point to point, day to day. And that's what the difficulty that people face in terms of trying to understand the implications. Just as a short summary, clouds re-radiate shortwave radiation, the very tops of them, because they're nice and white. That decreases the global temperature, but it's highly variable. You know how variable clouds are in time and space. CO2 is a moderate greenhouse gas that re-radiates long-wave radiation. Although it's at low concentrations, it's uniformly distributed. And that's what makes it one of the things that makes it so important. Water vapor is a far stronger greenhouse gas than CO2, and it increases temperature in the same way that CO2 would, but it is quite variable in space and time. And so these different kinds of factors playing off in their spatial and temporal relationships make it quite difficult to predict how the globe is actually changing. Volcanoes are another issue that you may have read a lot about, and volcanoes produce high volumes of aerosols and ash, which re-radiate shortwave radiation, decreasing temperature. But they're, again, also highly variable in space and time. And one will be interesting to see how much the globe cools down with the recent Icelandic volcanoes, although they're probably pretty small. This, by the way, is Mount St. Helens when I started working up there back in the early 1980s. And they also produce CO2, a greenhouse gas. So right now, we can begin to look at the total atmospheric carbon. It contains around 4.5 increment. It's growing at about 4.5 gigatons per year. And that's due to approximately 8.5 gigatons of fossil fuel that it's being released. But the oceans are absorbing around 3 gigatons, and the vegetation and soil about 1 gigaton. If we look at the total pools, that is the total amount stored, the atmosphere is actually one of the larger pools, but certainly not the largest. The plants contain almost as much as is in the atmosphere. The oceans contain far more, but the one I'll focus on is the soils, which contain more than about 2.5 times the amount that actually exists in plants. Now, this is very, again, as you can imagine, very dynamic. CO2 is absorbed, particularly in cool water, and it's also released in warmer waters. And then every day, all the plants take up CO2, and during the day and at night, the plants respire CO2 and the microbes respire CO2. So getting a handle on those very small fluxes makes a difference. Climate modeling. I don't want to spend too much time because this is not my area of expertise, but I do understand enough to read things like the IPCC report and to read and understand many of the papers that are published. And one of the things that the models do, and they have become very much of a straw man for impacts of CO2, but they're a very important tool in understanding and making recommendations for policy. For example, if you were going to drive to Yosemite, you would probably want a highway map. And if you didn't already know the details, which we don't know the details, and that map will be have all the major components in it, and as you want to deviate from the major route and understand different parts, you may get a map of greater and greater detail. But the map itself is simply a model of the drive from here to Yosemite. And it's the same thing when we think about the modeling of these large-scale systems. They're useful tools that are especially important in us understanding and making predictions about what might happen. Of course, from the IPCC report, there are different scenarios that depend upon both combinations of population growth. For example, the population has grown from 2.5 billion when I was born to about 6.8 billion today. And so we have different kinds of climate scenarios based upon the amount of human population growth and the use of carbon. And we can see that we have this, for example, if you go into the IPCC, they have the head in the sand mode, some different kinds of balanced growth technologies, and economic development and controlled growth. And those are only a few of the scenarios. So I do suggest that if you're interested in more of this, that you go read the IPCC report, because it is a very detailed analysis of future scenarios. The third piece of evidence is paleoclimate. And the reason that 450 ppm tipping point comes out is that James Hansen suggests that may be a point of no return. Why is it a point of no return? Well, from paleo, the last time the atmospheric CO2 was above 450 parts per million, there was no Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. Now, we're not going to melt Antarctica and Greenland. in the next 5 to 10 or 50 or probably even 100 years. But over the longer haul, we have to understand what are the implications, and that's where the paleo evidence gives us some information. The last time that the CO2 was that high, we had coastal redwoods that I collected the fossils of north of Yellowstone. So certainly the climate was very different the last time we reached these levels of atmospheric CO2 than today. And again, I don't want to go into too much dynamics, but I would say that we really don't have much knowledge of the implications of slight warming and slight cooling. And we can look at a lot of different periods in human history when the temperatures were a little bit higher or a little bit lower or a little more variation, and we see massive implications to human culture. The fourth piece of evidence, and this is really a tricky one, again, thinking about all of the spatial and temporal variation that actually occurs, and that is just the rate of temperature at the global scale that's been going on. And this is the temperature change since the 1880s. It's been estimated by NASA's Earth Science team. And that alone suggests that something is going on. And in fact, the evidence points to the fact that we are, in fact, warming up. Now, there's a lot of difficulty in figuring out how do we tease these data, and especially how do we understand the variation. And variation is always the difficulty whenever one is studying these types of processes. And to give you an example, what was the temperature today? Anybody know? Is that the high? What was the low? What was the temperature in 10 o'clock this morning? What was the temperature at 8 o'clock this morning? To give you an idea of how we do these and how we understand this, these are actually the data points. This is only over 3 days, a 3-day period, and we can see, and when I compute my carbon fluxes at the James Reserve, I'm measuring every 5 minutes, and so from one location, for me to calculate just the temperature impacts, I collect 864 data points within 3 days. So you can think about what number do we actually use, because there are thresholds, there are points at which carbon is fixed or released. All of these numbers have different implications, and so the average means very little. Other than that's why we have to figure out whether it's trending upwards or trimming downwards. Just to give you an idea, the NOAA and NASA models that have shown the increase use 7,200 stations. The Climatic Research Unit in Britain uses 5,000 stations. So that there's always going to be arguments between scientists as to what the temperature is. Some other pieces of information that tell us a lot about the global change, and then we can begin scaling it back down, and that is to use things like glaciers. Most of the glaciers in the world have been melting back. Not all, not everywhere, but this is just some of the glaciers that I've worked on, and I thought they were cool pictures, and I know I can't match Rich's, all of his pictures, but this is a U.S. Grant photo. This was not the Ulysses S. Grant, the general or president, but as I understand, one of his grandsons. But he took this picture of the Northwest Glacier, and then when we were there in 1992, we took this same picture. This is the same glacier. By the way, where I'm standing is at the base of this ridge. So that's the difference in the glacial meltback of this particular glacier. The Exit Glacier in Alaska that we worked on, this is 1992, and then Rick Reddick in entomology went back and took these pictures, and this little piece right here is this overgrown area here. So glaciers in general are melting back, and that's one of the things that leads our colleagues in China to worry about their water supply, because their water supply comes from having a stable glacier. What does this bode for California? Well, we're still trying to figure out all the details, But there's a few things that are kind of stand out that are interesting for California. This is the snow depth, and this is in February. And you can see basically since the 1940s when these records were taken, there's really no change in snow depth here, right? And that's been shown multiple times. If anything, the total snow in the Sierras is actually, the snow precipitation is going up. But one of the things that's been noted, this is Big Meadow in the southern Sierra, is that during the last couple of decades, what we're seeing in the April snow is more years in which that snow is melted out by April. And then if we look at the May snow, we have a number of years. In fact, most years, the snow is gone by May and not retained. Whether this trend will continue is, of course, a good question, but it means a lot in terms of our water policy. Michael Goulden and his colleagues at UC Irvine have looked at the Santa Rosa Mountains. Since 1977, they have suggested that the snow-rain ratio has shifted upwards by 327 meters, or approximately 1,000 feet. What does that mean? Well, one thing it means is that California, particularly in the Sierras, we depend upon the snowpack for our water. Now, that snowpack can melt rapidly and come down, or it can melt slowly. And the snow actually holds, that's the biggest reservoir in California. And if that starts melting out earlier and moving out, then one of the things that is going to happen is either the water's going to run off very fast, or we're going to have to figure out more ways to store it ourselves. And that's why Governor Schwarzenegger's called for building more dams. And you can imagine all the implications of building more dams, both in terms of policy and in cost. Okay, those are the pieces of evidence that I use coming from climate scientists and some of the observations that I had to help me understand the biological changes that both have occurred and might occur in the future, so that we can make some projections about how to manage our resources. There's been a lot of work by a number of biologists, and you can imagine the variation that one sees. But Camille Parmesan and her group estimated that particularly butterflies are moving about 6 kilometers north per decade, or about 6 meters up in elevation. That doesn't sound fast, but it does have implications for setting aside large lands for habitat protection. Oh, one other note, if you wonder why, as a biologist, I'm interested in California, this is native species diversity in California compared to the rest of the country. We're in one of the most exciting and interesting areas of the world, one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. So what we have done at the Center for Conservation Biology, in collaboration with all of my colleagues, students, and staff, is we've tried to begin building models of the distribution of animals and plants, and then projecting what the implications might be, especially if we're trying to set aside habitat for these species. One of the first we tried to do it with, that we worked on, was the California gnatcatcher. And one of the things you can see in these various colors is this dark red color that you see along here is the modeled habitat for this particular bird. And then all the little green spots, if you can actually see those, are the locations that we know that those birds exist. Now, if we add 2 degrees centigrade, or 2 degrees centigrade to this region and reanalyze the climate, this is where the habitat is left. Right in this area here, no longer back in these areas through here. So in other words, one of the concerns is, are we setting aside and purchasing a lot of habitat that may or may not be the greatest value in the future, and how do we then deal with some of those particular types of issues? We've done that with a number of species now that can help us then figure out both habitat to protect and ways to move. This is the Quino Checkerspot Butterfly. and you can see that brown circle, that blue circle is actually the approximate historical range. This is the modeled habitat, again, the dark color for today. And if we project that 2 degrees increase in centigrade, what we see is, again, a shifting up the range that would occur in response to of the habitat for that particular species. Now, it's always hard whenever one talks about individual species to figure out where they're actually going to go, what they're actually doing. But some correlative evidence is of concern to us. And that is, if we look at these green dots, those green dots represent the known locations for the Quino Checkerspot Butterfly. If we look at the red dots, those are all the historical known distribution points for Quino Checkerspot Butterfly where they have gone extinct. They are no longer present. And the blue dots are where we found newly discovered populations since 1998. Now, it's possible that people only began to look recently up there, but it's not likely when you have something as colorful as a Quino Checkerspot Butterfly. So what we've assumed, and certainly the major cause of loss of the habitat for these species is, in fact, the growth of Los Angeles and San Diego and Orange County. But there may be another subtle factor at work when we change the distributions this dramatically and in a way that's consistent with some of our other analyses. Other studies that people have done, Lori Hargrove, a doctoral student in the biology department working with John Rotenberry, documented the redistribution of a number of bird species since the 1979-1981 census to today. And what she found, for example, at the mountain quail, that it moved up from about its maximum distribution here was about 1,700, moved up to 2,200 feet. And the numbers that used to exist down here at the lower end basically disappeared. So it is moving up in elevation. Other species that people like Mike Goulden and his group have looked at include things like some of the dominant trees. So after 1977, there was just before 1977, just after, there was a major fire on the Santa Rosa Mountain. And so it reset this system. And so then what he did was to go back and look at the redistribution of those same species before versus after. And one of the things he noted was a movement upward in a number of the different species on that particular location. So what that suggests is that there are patterns of redistribution of organisms that we need to think about whenever we start doing things like planning and setting aside and managing lands for both endangered species and our biota in general. And so one of the things we have done is tried to make a number of projections of where some of the species that are costing the taxpayer the most for protecting their habitat. This is one. You will all recognize the desert tortoise, I'm sure. And if we look in the Joshua Tree and Coachella Valley area, Cam Barrows has mapped out the distribution of these organisms, and then we modeled their habitat. And the white and brown tells us the habitat where in the Joshua Tree National Park where the desert tortoise can live. If we increase the temperature by 1 degree centigrade and drop the precipitation, average precipitation, by 75 millimeters, the brown is what's left. So in other words, much of the potential habitat all through Southern California, where this particular species of concern has the potential to change dramatically under a climate change scenario. Now that becomes especially important when we start thinking about the land that we're purchasing and setting aside for management. Riverside County will spend something like $7 billion to protect habitat in the western part of the county. And what that is if you look, what the point is that this red circle is the historical known distributions of a species of concern, say the desert tortoise or the fringe-toed lizard. And so they have shrunk back, and we don't know why. Some, that's no longer suitable habitat. Others might be suitable habitat, but it's currently unoccupied. Of that, part of that is set aside for protection, part is unprotected, and then, of course, being a biologist, there's always an unknown section. So one of the things that we have done for many of these species is we're purchasing land to protect this area to set aside and save these particular species. What happens when something like a changing environment occurs and takes away part of that habitat? We don't know whether that's going to take it out of the suitable but unoccupied, the no longer suitable, but we know it'll take it out of the protected area. And because we are a biodiversity hotspot, we have a large number of species that are in this predicament. This is just an example of some of the species in the Coachella Valley multiple species habitat conservation plan in which the land is being purchased and set aside as we speak. The flat-tailed horned lizard, the Conch thrasher, the Coachella Valley milk vetch, and the giant sand treader cricket, which you can see kicking out the sand here. And so what we have is a multiple habitat conservation plan in which we've set aside land to try to protect all these species together because there are so many of them. What happens when we overlay global change and we overlay something like a solar development? So now all of a sudden we're pitting environmentalist against environmentalist. And that makes the choices very, very difficult. Because if we develop part of this habitat for solar panels, as many of you have seen, large-scale solar development, and we do something like relocate the tortoises that are in that particular area, do we actually move them to suitable but unoccupied habitat, which changes, or do we move them to no longer suitable habitat? And our predictive ability is not all that good. All we know is that the desert tortoise relocation that's currently has occurred in presentations given at meetings, there's greater than a 50% loss of those tortoises that are moved. And I might point out that all of those data have not been made publicly available or put into refereed publications. I want to layer another complication onto this for you, and that is that we not only worry about the change that occurs, but the size of the area and how it's changing through time. And this is especially true for California's environment because we live in a highly variable environment. So here's Population Biology 101. If we look along this x-axis, these are data of the California fringe-toed lizard, the little guy here in the corner. If we look across the x-axis, this is the number of individuals at any one point in time. Along the y-axis, we have is the number the year later. So that gives us an idea of the reproductive output. In other words, it tells us whether the population is increasing or whether it's decreasing. And this red line that goes right through here is the dividing line. If we're above this line, the population is growing. If we're below this line, the population is falling. And is that good? Is that bad? Well, it's important to remember that when we live in a variable environment, like we do in California, there are a number of years in which a population is below that line, and a number of years that are good wet years when the population above that line. And it cycles round and around and around that line. The difficulty comes when we start putting development on top of these vulnerable populations. This is our model of the habitat for the fringe-toed lizard in Coachella Valley, assuming no development. And you can see that it could occupy all of this, it would have occupied all of this area before the expansion of the population growth in Palm Springs. And so if the weather was a little bit drier, the populations would grow up in this area, and if it was wetter, they would expand through this whole region, so that they could continue maintaining this balance that was necessary for long-term survival. This is what the habitat looks like today. As you can see, no big surprises here. Most of the area that's down south of the I-10 is no longer good habitat for the fringe-toed lizard. But there's still some fairly large areas, particularly down here in the southern and eastern part of the valley. But this is what is projected to happen when we when we increase the temperature and potentially drop the moisture. These areas down here become very vulnerable, and those are projected to be populations that we would lose. Those populations should remain fairly stable, but that's not much area in which to maintain a large population of this particular species. So it's very important to understand not only where we purchase this land to protect, but also the entire range that is set aside for the protection of these species. So it's not just a point, and it's not a point of today's, but it's a point of yesterday's, because that tells us something about the biology and projections for tomorrow. And it's also important to note that if we're going to protect these species, they have to have the ability to move. And there are places where they can move and places where they can't move. And I have to give credit for this slide to one of my students, Michelle Murphy. Some other implications for the biota of California. This is the clapper rail. This is the San Diego Tijuana estuary. This is the sea line right today with the satellite image. And one of the things we can see, there's the beach, but the San Diego 2050 has made a series of projections of where that sea level change will occur. Remember, the sea level rise partially comes from any melting ice, but just as importantly, it comes from the expansion of the ocean as it warms up. These are areas that San Diego projects will be, this is wetland that will be lost, where it will be within the tide range, and that actually consists of most of the breeding habitat for the clapper rail. This is another potentially endangered species in San Diego. This is San Diego Mission Bay, and you can see again those magenta lines. Most of you have been in the Mission Bay area. These are all the houses that will be within the projected tide range for the year 2050. And the cost of that might weigh a little bit against the cost of trying to do something about mitigating the CO2 and global warming today. A few other things, because the biology is important. There's a relatively new set of studies out that's been looking. One projection is that the oceans can absorb the CO2, that increased CO2 from the atmosphere. But one of the things that we've begun to notice is the change in ocean chemistry. And as that CO2 is absorbed, it mixes with water, forming bicarbonate and releasing a hydrogen ion. That's called the ocean acidification. That hydrogen ion, importantly, will basically pick up the carbonate from the calcium carbonate. So we have calcium carbonate also in the ocean, and the hydrogen preferentially binds that carbonate to the calcium, producing again more carbonate. The important thing is this calcium carbonate is what's necessary for coral reef formation. And the models predict that above 480 ppm CO2, does that number ring a bell? Above 480 ppm CO2, that the ocean carbonate drops below the critical, calcium carbonate drops below the critical level for forming coral shells, which is about 200 micromoles calcium carbonate per kilogram, and coral reefs are no longer formed. And we do know that this has happened in the past. A side component that's just beyond the CO2, because when we burn fossil fuels for CO2, it also releases a number of other compounds, one of which is nitrous oxides. And all of you in Riverside have looked across towards Los Angeles and seen that light brown haze that comes across. Those are nitrous oxides. For those of you who haven't heard the story, we get as much nitrogen deposited on our lawns and in the wildlands here as a farmer would apply to a small grain field. So, and what grows best when you add nitrogen to a garden or a field? The weeds. And the weeds also do very well with that particular nitrogen addition in our wildlands. And so some of the implications are increased invasive plant density and production. Now, the invasives have been here. They've been here for 300 to 400 years. But their production is tightly coupled to the amount of nitrogen that's available. And whenever we have production in Southern California, we always have a dry season. And when we have a dry season, we get fires. And so that is one of the concerns with changing the productivity of invasive species. So the projected impacts of poor CO2 management include shifting carbon sinks to source, particularly in the Arctic and the boreal forest, increased fire frequency and longer drought periods. It doesn't matter whether the whether the temperature actually goes up and there's more drought. The fact that the temperature goes up means that the snow melts off quicker. Increasing storm intensities. All of these are being debated and studied in the scientific literature, but they're all postulated changes. Responses to date of the federal government. This is the North Slope of Alaska when I was up there a few years ago. The area, this is a map of Alaska, and you'll see the area in yellow. The area in yellow has just been opened for bidding for offshore oil drilling. That's most of the ice-free part of the Arctic Ocean. And then we know what some of the implications from ocean drilling for oil are. This is the best image I could get from the Gulf of Mexico on April 25th. Now, one of the projections you'll notice, I put it down here. I thought I'd blow it up, but then I figured I'd get in trouble. This is a nice little offshore oil rig, which is pulling up CO2 or pulling up carbon, and then it's actually pumping CO2 back down. So it's going to solve the problem, and that is the DOE's newest projection for solving the CO2 problem. I guess I have to give away my bias in that I'm not particularly excited about big-term solutions. I think there are solutions, and let's talk a little bit about some of those. One of them is large-scale wind and solar development, and in which California is a major player. But one of the things that's frustrating to those of us as biologists is that to date, I know of not a single published study on the impacts of wind turbines on the raptors and the bats in the West. There are a few back east and a few in Europe, but that's an area that there's supposedly results, but they have not been out and subject to scientific scrutiny. Solar development. Again, some solar development is very necessary, but if you begin to look at the number of projects, these are the lines of the solar development, and these are all the places where solar development is projected to occur. Around 1 million acres are projected to go into solar development. Solar development is fine, but at a very large scale. This is the solar power unit near Kramer Junction, and you can see what it does is that they have stripped the vegetation completely bare underneath wherever the solar panels are, and nothing is allowed to regrow. This is what the Mojave Desert looks like outside that solar panel. And I'm sure it's very hard to see, but you'll see a lot of water vapor coming up because the large-scale solar developments are largely based upon using a steam turbine right now. And what that means is that the groundwater and any clean water has to be used for solar development and who knows what else. I'd also like to point out that as a biologist, I have a little bit of difficulty because the deserts are viewed as a low fixation. And we know that. Deserts are not very productive. They don't fix a lot of carbon. But think about the root systems. If you walk across down an arroyo in the desert, those roots are incredibly deep. And so of the carbon that's fixed, much of it goes into very, very deep roots and microbes. And so the deserts may have low fixation, but they have very high sequestration. And so the total flux in all of our deserts is actually very high. And if we take away too much of that and it becomes exotics, those exotics do not bury carbon. Environmental organizations have solutions. They've proposed that because the tropics fix a lot of carbon, that the average household uses around 5,600 pounds of carbon, or 2,545 kilograms of carbon per year. The tropical rainforest will fix around 1,000 kilograms per year. So if you would give money to the environmental organizations so that they can purchase 6 to 10 acres, then you can make your conscience feel good about covering your carbon needs. But one other question is how many people that live there are displaced. And the other thing is that carbon does not include the industrial output. Well, let's get a real solution. Microbes to the rescue. Microbes that are associated with plants are actually very, very interesting in that this is where most of the natural carbon is actually fixed in the soil. Plants, of course, fix the carbon, translocate it to their root systems, and you can see all these little bitty hyphae. In fact, usually 1 to 3 miles of hyphae for every cubic centimeter of soil. And what those individual hyphae do is that they get together and they excrete a lot of different compounds, including various kinds of proteins that form soil aggregates. And these aggregates actually comprise as much as 25 to 50% of the stable organic carbon in soil. So these microbes actually are the best friends that we have for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Just to give you an idea what the carbon sinks are, yes, you can give your money, and I would encourage it to purchase to help the environmental organizations in the tropics. But the tropics fix around 100 grams per meter squared per year. But the James Reserve will fix around 20 to 30. 100-year-old chaparral has been shown to fix up to 52. Baja Desert has even been shown during wet years to fix a very, very large amount of carbon. So what I would argue is that the California wildlands, and particularly things like the habitat conservation plans, are worth supporting for many reasons. Not only are they the locations, and by their very nature can find ways for organisms to move, but those are the places where carbon can be sequestered. And finally, solar voltaics, photovoltaics are a real solution, although they're often overlooked. Daryl Jenred on our faculty has calculated that in the Los Angeles basin, photovoltaics could provide as much as 80% of the annual energy needs for Los Angeles. We recently put up solar voltaics on our photovoltaics on our house, and I don't pay any electric bill, and I like that. So in conclusion, what is the solution? I don't know, but I think there's a lot of small solutions that can go. The city of Riverside has been incredibly supportive of green technologies. Our campus is, and I think there's tremendous opportunities. And in summary, our globe has incredible resilience, incredible capacity to deal with the insults that we've managed to create. But we are part of that. And so simply improving our environment has many benefits for both us and our species. And one of those is careful carbon management. Thank you. I guess I'm supposed to answer questions here. The question was, would you consider, we can talk about carbon offsets that are being considered. I think that they have a potentially very important role in that, again, because we know that wildlands have the capacity to absorb a lot, carbon offsets represent one way in which, by industry knowing what their carbon production is, and then purchasing the amount of wildland or the amount of agricultural land that can actually known to fix that amount of carbon, you can actually at least stabilize the amount of carbon coming back out. We just did a calculation for the Western Riverside County Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan. If carbon offset credits were to accrue to the county, they could actually pay for the management and for the management and monitoring program for the county. So it has the real, based upon the European costs of carbon offsets. So it has a potential. It does have a potential for being gamed, as several people have pointed out. But if we're careful, we have the capability, we have the technology, and we have the ability now to measure that. There is no reason for the gaming to occur because we can measure it if we're allowed to do that. Yeah, the question was, is there a reason why the northern areas tend to show more of an impact than the southern areas? There's a couple of reasons. One is the northern area is more terrestrial than the southern area. The southern area is ocean, so it's not producing. The biggest reason is that the poles are actually showing the greatest amount of warming compared to the tropical regions, is that the polar regions are drier, and the water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas. And so because there's so much water around the equator, and as you expand into the temperate zones, that dominates the climate of the globe. And as you move farther north, then you have more of a CO2 effect because the water vapor drops off. Mulch. You know, most of the depleted soils, the carbon depleted soils, are really in agricultural lands. And good management practices, minimum tillage types of agriculture, can put a lot of carbon back into those systems. And they can become, the soils should become net sinks rather than net sources. And so good agricultural practices can do that, and can do that very effectively. And wildlands, you know, one of the things we did was some experimental analysis in chaparral, and we showed that as the atmospheric CO2, those plants are burying carbon as fast as they possibly can. And so that we do know that the carbon buried in soils is going up as a function, not as fast as the atmosphere, but they do have that capacity. Yeah. There probably is. The question was, is there biological purpose for all that protein that the mycorrhizal fungi produce? And there probably is, but we're not certain what it is yet. There's one of the things that I've argued is that it's actually a protective mechanism. These are interesting fungi. I don't know, think about the molds in your refrigerator. So you get a little biology. I love the question because I can go forever. But when you think about those hyphae that grow along your bread mold, that cause the bread mold, those have little segments all the way through them. So it's a tube with little segments. So it blocks off anything. Well, the fungi that form this particular type of mycorrhiza that really produces this glycoprotein has no cross walls. It's just a long tube with genetic material and everything else scattered through it. And one of the things that we've noticed is the nematodes and mites and other critters do not like to eat these hyphae. And so a colleague of mine took a microprobe and stuck it in one of these hyphae, and it just glommed right up immediately, and he got no data. And so every time you try to poke a hole into one of these hyphae, it just seals itself right up with this particular glycoprotein. So, I think of it as protection from a nematode attack. A nematode comes along, one of Jim Baldwin's critters tries to eat one of my critters, and it comes along, it pokes its stylet right into that hyphae, and so it can't do anything anymore. That's the best explanation I can come up with. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. They have to do that because the plants would actually interfere with the reflection, and depending upon which kind of plants you get there, and you produce a lot of dust. And so what they'll do is they usually stabilize. They remove the vegetation and they stabilize it with salts or some other kind of material so that it won't blow. So it's just really pretty harsh material that's right on that. Now, remember that that's only the area where the unit goes. So again, like most things, it's a matter of scale. If we were to have some in the right locations, and particularly in old agricultural areas, in which the habitat is already lost for organisms, there's no reason not to use those for good large-scale solar development. But we don't know what's going on. I don't know how many of you read the Press Enterprise this morning where the California Energy Commission said, no, you can't use old agricultural lands to put these solar developments on, and which makes no sense, but I sometimes wonder what the point of what the California Energy Commission is really after. Yeah. The question was, if, is anybody considering warehouses and the individual houses? And yes, they are. And in fact, that's the basis of Daryl Jenneret's calculation, is that those warehouses have tremendous surface area for photovoltaic activity. And I'll encourage again. The difficulty for most photovoltaic, for most people, is generating the cash for that initial upfront purchase. And, there's got to be some ways to deal with that. The city has done a marvelous job of Riverside. When we bought ours, they immediately, we got a rebate of about a third of the price of a little over a third of the price of our photovoltaic. Because the city gets all the extra electricity that we generate. That's fine by me. And then by the time you do the various tax incentives, there's really a potential for a lot of more use of these than we've given it in the past. The question was, who do you contact to get that information? And I had an advantage because the James Reserve, where we have all of our computers and all of our equipment and all of our stuff running, is off the grid. And so the guy who did this James Reserve said he would help me. And there are the companies that will help. The city was very helpful. The city electrical utilities was very helpful in helping us set that all up. So they're very cooperative.
You go online, City of Riverside website, and it's all there.
City of Riverside website, it's all there. So, why don't you go ahead and get the, yeah.
Why isn't that water being bottled instead of just letting it melt into the ocean? Why don't we use it?
I think
instead of watching it melt, why don't we try and use it? That could help. But what effects would that also do? Would it mess up the circular ocean system or anything like that?
Well, probably not, but I'd imagine it's probably like drinking from a fire hose. And then you have to transport that water from, you know, there's one particular area of Antarctica in which the glaciers are melting, and other places where it's stable. But I think more importantly, that water is being used in many tropical areas, particularly the area in western China that we visited recently, where they're worried about their glaciers. And that is the water that they're using. And their problem is it's running off, and they're using it faster than the new snow. So the snowfall is actually coming in faster. They're getting more snowfall than they used to, but the glacier's melting at the same time. And what they're worried about is as it melts back, is if you project out, I don't know, nobody really knows the number, but at least a century. But when you start projecting out the water use of those tropical glaciers in particular, that water is used, but it doesn't have the potential to last forever. That's the bigger concern. Yeah, and I think it's just simply a matter of getting the water down there. And in Greenland, most of the melt that's actually occurring is is quite a ways north. And how are you going to get that water down south? The transportation cost for that amount of water is actually quite large.
One more. How big a role does volcanism and production play in the whole carbon cycle into how much CO2 is in the atmosphere? Do we know if this is cyclic?
You'll have to. The question was the role of volcanism and continental movement, and I would direct that to a good geologist. But I will say that if we look back through history, certainly we know that the eruptions play a very large role in the climate monitoring, just because of the aerosols and the particulates. But it also, there are time periods in which hypothesized to be one of the drivers of the big CO2 changes that occurred that I was talking about before. So volcanism is a very, very important. Whether it's cyclical or not, I don't know the answer to that.